the fundamental thing to remember and remind yourselves of all the time about cognitive linguistics is that we are not just studying the surface appearance of language, but more ambitiously, we're actually studying what is going on behind the scenes when we speak and more generally when we think. And it turns out that there is a lot that's going on, okay? And so language only shows us a very small aspect. Language is extremely powerful, but it's powerful in order to trigger these much more elaborate mental constructions. So, hidden behind simple words and everyday language that, of course, all human beings, basically, almost all human beings can do, there are vast conceptual networks manipulated unconsciously through the activation of powerful neural circuits. And even though we take all this for granted, because for us it's so easy, we've learned as children, our brain unconsciously has learned these tremendously complex connections, but so we take them for granted, and everybody around us can do them, and we don't see them as mysterious or complex, but in fact they are. And this is true, of course, of many aspects of human cognition. For example, vision, we also take for granted. We take our eyes as just, like a camera taking pictures of the outside world. This is not, in fact, as you know, this is not what's happening. What's happening is, on the basis of partial information from the outside world, our brains are building the world that we see, that we experience. Okay? So everything that goes on is much more complex than what we are consciously aware of. Furthermore, another very interesting and fundamental aspect of cognitive linguistics is that language and thought are embodied. The mind is not like a computer separated from the body. In fact, the mind is not at all like a computer, for one thing. But also, body and mind work together. And you cannot have a mind without a body without a mind, needless to say. But also, the entire system of building the mappings that we need is actually a body plus mind construction. And this explains why, of course, naively, we might think that, let's say, chess or mathematics or something is much harder than language, because everybody can speak, but it's hard to learn chess. But in fact, if you ask the question, what is harder, to program a computer to play chess at the grandmaster level, or to program a computer to speak like a 3-year-old? Well, the 3-year-old simulation is much, much more complex, and in fact has not been even remotely approximated by any computer or computational model at this point. Whereas, of course, there exist models that can even beat world champion Kasparov. You can relate that, by the way, to another aspect here, that chess is high level and has been simulated computationally, but the low-level activity of just moving the chess pieces on the board, okay, that is simulating what the body does by trying to build robots, well, again, that is much harder than mastering the game of chess itself. So this has been achieved, the simulation of the game of chess itself. Does this show a light? No, I don't think so. Okay. Fortunately, I have the old-fashioned pointer, and if I stretch a little bit. Okay, so chess can be simulated, but very simple, what we take to be very simple motion cannot be. And the same is true of language at all levels, whether it's language for speech, phonology, phonetics, syntax, and of course the much more mysterious world of meaning. Now, in the lectures that I will try to give over the next few days, again, the background will be this, that language is only the tip of the iceberg, that meaning construction that is crucial in order to understand language is also operating in many other areas of human activity, art, mathematics, religion, technology, poetry, etc. And in fact, those areas of human activity are typically the ones that are distinct for human beings, that other species do not have. And one of the reasons we surmise why this is the case is precisely because the kinds of conceptual mappings that humans have are not the same as, let's say, other primates and a fortiori other species. Therefore, and this is the methodology here, therefore, linguistics sheds light on general human thinking. It's not just a study of an isolated little piece. A big mistake, a great mistake of generative grammar, for example, which was popular in the 1970s and 1980s still. A great mistake of generative grammar was to isolate language and study it as a separate kind of thing, different from other things that humans do. And that prevented linguistics from actually connecting to the other deeper aspects of meaning and sort of, just didn't look at meaning at all, looked at just superficial syntax. Very uninteresting, actually, way of studying linguistics. But notice, conversely, the study of meaning construction in other domains, understanding meaning construction in religion, in art, in poetry, will help us also do linguistics because it will help us to understand these aspects of mappings and meaning constructions that we need. So the two go together. So cognitive linguistics is not divorced from cognitive science in general. Okay? You have to look at everything in order to understand the general principles. But conversely, cognitive science depends very strongly on linguistics because the evidence we have from language is fantastic evidence. There's so much language data out there that if we interpret that as we should, if we do grammar in the right way and meaning interpretation also, then we will also have much greater insight into general cognition, not just linguistic cognition. Okay, this is the outline of the lectures that will come, and I will start by this morning by talking to you about mental spaces that organize a lot of our backstage cognition. I call backstage cognition these unconscious operations that are going on when we think and when we speak. And then we'll go on to conceptual mappings, and in particular, the study of conceptual integration, which has been a very fertile ground for the scientific study of mind in the last 10 or 15 years. Okay? So this afternoon, we'll look at conceptual integration, and then tomorrow morning, we'll look at some very new work on causal compression. And again, how human beings are capable of, on the basis of very, very sparse information from language, to rebuild very complex causal sequences. Again, that is a striking feature of our species. We don't just go word to meaning, one word, one meaning, and so on. From a few words, we build huge meanings. This brings in the fourth lecture on emergent structure, on creativity, the fact that we are creative in our everyday life, but of course, even more, some groups will, using the same mappings, the same integrations, the same conceptual systems, will create new organizations, And this will account for the progress of mathematics. It will account for artistic creativity. It will account for technology. So there's a great question here, both about the child learning and being creative in learning the system, and the entire culture being creative in expanding from one generation to the next, using these fundamental conceptual mappings, expanding various areas. Then we'll talk about metaphor in the 5th lecture, and as you well know, you had George Lakoff here a few years ago. As you well know, metaphor is one of the cornerstones of cognitive linguistics and of human thought. We'll talk then about grammar and how grammatical constructions are also dependent on these conceptual mappings. And then I will, in the 7th lecture, I will discuss with you our theory about the origins of language and thought, which is connected, again, to the evidence, to the data we get from the mappings, but also the archaeological evidence and the genetic evidence. And then we'll connect to material culture and see how the linguistic systems correspond to technological systems, to the elaboration of the computers, of ATM machines, for example, where you get your money, of airplane cockpits, airplane dials, very appropriate for this university, specialized in aeronautics and astronautics. And then in the last 2 lectures, I will expand in other directions. I will show you more complex aspects of integration. And finally, in the last lecture, reflect on what all this means for methods we should use as linguists, okay, and as more generally as cognitive scientists. Okay, so let me start then this morning with the first part, a background for the rest that we'll need for the other lectures, and that's the study of mental spaces. Now, mental spaces are a very simple idea, and for those of you not very familiar with it, I will illustrate it with some very intuitive examples, and you'll see it's a very intuitive idea, not one actually that's either abstract or questionable. The basic idea is that when we think, we can partition our thinking into separate mental spaces, and we can connect them together. So let me give you some informal examples of that. The kinds of things that you see here are examples. For example, in the story of Superman that some of you probably know, Superman is also Clark Kent, a man who works in an office and who is in love, I think, with Lois Lane, something like that. Lois Lane has no idea that Clark Kent is Superman. The reader knows that there are 2 separate mental spaces, one in which you have Superman, and the other one in which you have Clark Kent working in the office, and the 2, of course, are connected, Clark Kent and Superman, although they don't look alike, and they don't have the same powers, and they are yet the same person. And many other examples follow here. For example, the actor Sean Connery is connected to the character in the movie James Bond. Baby Georgie and President Bush in the United States are the same person, although they don't look alike or have the same functions or do the same things. And I'll show you the next example in just a minute. We will see more relations later, but some of the very basic relations are identity, analogy, representation, and causal relations, cause to effect. So let me illustrate. This is a painting by an obscure French painter, actually, Natoire, and it has Aphrodite in here. Aphrodite is the goddess of love in the Greek mythology. Okay? And I think in English, actually, they pronounce Aphrodite, I should say. Aphrodite in French, but Aphrodite in English. So Aphrodite is the goddess of love, and you can see in the painting she is represented, okay? Way up there. In this other painting, much earlier painting, because the first one was 1700 something, this one is the late 15th century. It's a famous painting by Botticelli, and it's the birth of Venus. And Venus, of course, is the same as Aphrodite. Venus is the Roman name, Aphrodite is the Greek name. So we have these two paintings. And when we see the two paintings, without any special mental effort, because we know the frames of painting and the frames of mythology and the frames of representation, we immediately, unconsciously, construct a number of mental spaces. And I will diagram them for you, sort of in sequence. I represent the mental spaces with circles. The circles are just a pedagogical way of talking about these mental spaces. So here, in the case of the paintings and Greek mythology, you have a mental space here. When we think of this, we think of the Greek gods and the goddess of love and the, and different other, the sun god and so on. And then in each one of the paintings, there's a representation of a little piece of the mythology. And so in the first one, the Natoire painting, you have one representation of Aphrodite. And in the other one, of course, you have a representation of Venus. So this is A prime, A double prime, and A in the three different mental spaces. You can see that they're all connected in the sense that this is meant by the painter, A prime is meant to be Aphrodite, that is, to be identical to A, the actual goddess, who is a fictive goddess, by the way, probably, so it's in our imagination that we have the mental space of the gods. And, I put in, there's a mistake here, because I had another painting at first, and so this is the Botticelli painting, not the Velázquez painting. And there we go, it's corrected. Okay. Now, you can see that because A double prime is identical to A, and A prime is identical to A, then A prime and A double prime are also identical. So the two characters in the paintings are the same person, namely Venus or Aphrodite. I put in these little rectangles, I put properties of the elements in the mental spaces, because you can see that they can be different from one mental space to the other. These A double prime and A prime do not look like each other, and they don't have the same name, but they are identical by virtue, of course, of both being the goddess Aphrodite. Okay, but now, presumably, each one of the painters was using a model. And so, think of the first painter, Natoire. There is his painting, but there is also, we can think of his studio, of his artist studio. And that, of course, is a different mental space. They're not the same thing. And in the artist studio, there would be a model, Lise, I've called her Lise up there, and it's B, you see the element B in the mental space, and her name is Lise, and she is a model for the character in the painting. Now, the two, A prime and B, are related by a representation relation, but not by an identity relation. Venus, of course, or Aphrodite, is not the same person as Lise. Those are two different persons, even though one is the model for the other in the representation. So you can see that the painting represents, on the one hand, Aphrodite in the world of the gods, and also represents Lise because Lise was the model. These are two different representations, of course. And same thing for the Botticelli painting, Botticelli studio, and the model Color Isabella, if we don't know who the model is. Okay, so now, taking all that into account, we see that in just looking at the paintings, we're able to build immediately 5 mental spaces. The mental space for the gods, the mental space for the first painting, Natoire, the second painting, Botticelli, the studio, Natoire studio, Botticelli studio. Okay? And they're connected in various ways. Now, how are they connected? Well, we already saw that there was identity of A and A prime and A double prime. Okay, so that's identity. And then we also, of course, saw that there was a representation relation, R, going from A prime to B and A double prime to C. No identity. This is the models. There's representation, and there's probably analogy because the painting looks like the model. So there's also an analogy relation between the two. But now, there's also a representation relation up there. So A prime is both identical to A, the goddess Venus, Aphrodite, and also represents in the painting, A prime is a representation of the goddess. Okay? So up there, we have two relations, I and R, identity and representation. Down here, we have only representation. And if we complete the whole picture, then, here's what we find. There's also identity between A prime and A double prime. Now, crucially, there is no representation relation here because Natoire, the second painter, was not trying to represent the woman in Botticelli's painting at all. He was trying to represent Venus. He was not copying on the painting of Botticelli. So even though we look at the two paintings and we say, oh, they're identical, it's the same person, but one is not a representation of the other. Okay? So this is a simple example. This example with the, with the famous paintings, the Botticelli and Natoire paintings, this is an example to show you independently of language here, because we don't need language explicitly. We need language to talk about it, but we don't need language to have these mental spaces form in our head. We can just look at the paintings, and because of our prior knowledge of what paintings are, how they're done, the frames, and so on, we can have these mental spaces very easily. Now, as a matter of fact, I looked on the internet this morning, and I was surprised but happy to find that the painting by Botticelli, it says here, is believed to be a celebration of the love of Giuliano somebody, Giuliano de' Medici, with Simonetta Cataneo Vespucci. Okay? So independently of the fact that it represents Venus, for the people at that time, they could also interpret it as a representation of a familiar nobility. Giuliano on the one hand, Simonetta on the other. So they were forming an additional mental space that you and I would not spontaneously form, but they would add the mental space that, oh, this is a painting of Venus, but it's also a painting of Simonetta. And in fact, this little internet information says that Simonetta was also believed to be the model for the painting. So now you can see things get very interesting and complicated, because in the mental space with models, I put Isabella, but it turns out it's Simonetta. So Simonetta is in the mental space of the model in the studio, but she's also in a different mental space where there is a love story with Giuliano, and the painting is connecting to that story. Okay? And we could, of course, add to all this. So the capacity of human beings for immediately building very intricate networks of mental spaces is a very strong, again, very strong capacity and very powerful capacity. Quickly, here's an illustration of these fundamental relations that we have. Identity, I took this basketball example from my colleague Shana Colson, I think, and I don't know how many of you follow the American basketball NBA, but Michael Jordan was a famous basketball player, and he at one time played for the Chicago Bulls, and then he played for another team that he founded that was the Washington Wizards. And so we can say in 1993, Jordan played for the Bulls, now he plays for the Wizards. And we set up very easily a mental space for 1993, mental space for, not today exactly, but 2002, let's say. And then, of course, it's the same Michael Jordan, but he has different properties. In fact, he's not as good a player as he was before, and so on. This is a little bit different from analogy mapping. So Kobe Bryant is another famous basketball player in the U.S., in California. And so, again, here you can say something using language. You can say, Kobe Bryant is the Jordan of the 21st century. Okay? And what that does is it connects Jordan in the basketball frame with Kobe in the basketball frame, but in two different centuries, the mental spaces. And it transfers, of course, properties from one to the other, so that this tells us that Kobe Bryant is a very good player, has a great future, and so on. And finally, the representation mapping that we talked about with the Botticelli and Natoire paintings, and again, there's a thing like a pipe, which of course on the screen here is not a thing, it's still a picture of the pipe, but imagine that that's a pipe, and then there's a picture of the pipe, which is a representation of the pipe. Okay, so those are very fundamental relations. A mental space has a content. If you look at your handout now, on the first page of the handout, you have these examples. And they all have in common the fact that the content is you climbing Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier is a mountain in the northwest of the U.S., okay, in the state of Washington, I think, but in the northwest. And all of these say that you're climbing Mount Rainier, but they say it in different mental spaces. In the first one, there's a time, 2001. So climbing is 2001. In the second one, it's a counterfactual construction. It says if you had climbed Mount Rainier. So in fact, you didn't climb Mount Rainier. But I can set up a mental space, a counterfactual mental space, where you did climb Mount Rainier. Okay? And that's, of course, using words like if, or using various grammatical constructions. The third one, Max believes that you climbed Mount Rainier. This is a mental space for Max's beliefs, which can be completely different, of course, from reality or anything else. In the picture, so somebody draws a picture of you climbing Mount Rainier, and even though you never saw Mount Rainier, you never went there, in the picture, you are climbing Mount Rainier. And same thing, okay. So these Mount Rainier examples, they all have what we call space builders. Each one has a linguistic device, a prepositional phrase, in 2001, a special kind of conjunction, if, a subject-verb complex, Max believes, or another prepositional phrase in the picture. And by means of these grammatical elements, we set up the various mental spaces. Okay? Now, as I mentioned before, you don't have to have grammatical elements to have mental spaces form in your head. We saw the example with the paintings. But language typically can explicitly tell you what kind of mental space to set up, whether it's a time space, a hypothetical space with if, a belief space, Max believes, or a representation space in the picture. Okay? Now, when we set up all these mental spaces, and believe me, when we talk, we're setting up many, many, many of them. There is in order to be able to keep track, to go from one to the other, to know what is connected, what is not connected, there is a fundamental principle of connection between the mental spaces. And that principle, the access principle, tells you that if you have two counterparts, two connected counterparts, A connected to B, A in one mental space, B in a different mental space, then in order to identify B, in order to access B, you have a choice. You can either access B directly using the properties in its own mental space, or you can access it through its counterpart. You go to the counterpart A, you describe A, and then you connect to B. Okay? So let's look and see how that can work. So here's a little example. This is a comic strip which actually my friend and colleague Ron Langaker gave me many years ago. He said, hey, here's a good example of mental spaces. And I had to modify it a little bit because at the time it was the older George Bush, you know, the father who was president. Okay. Well, assume this is now the younger George Bush. And you see, one of the men on the bench here is asking he's asking what was the president's name in 1958? Now, most people would understand that as saying, let's see, who was president in 1958? And then if they know it was Eisenhower, they say, oh, Eisenhower. And then they would answer, the name was Eisenhower. But the other guy answers George Bush. Why does he answer George Bush? Because we can interpret the first sentence in a different way. What was the president's name in 1958? Well, the president is George Bush. So what was the president's name? What was George Bush's name in 1958? Well, his name was still George Bush. He hasn't changed names, right? So the two readings depend on the possibility of using the access principle. Over here, you see that you start out with your initial space. We call this the base space that you start out with. It's up there in 2008, okay? Now, and then you say in 1958, and then you're looking for the president. Now, the mental space 1958 contains, on the one hand, A prime, who's the counterpart of George Bush. So A prime can be a young child or a baby, you know, but it's whoever George Bush was in 1958, and of course, happens to have A prime has the name George Bush. On the other hand, you have, in that mental space 1958, you have another element, B, corresponding to a different person, President Eisenhower, and that's the man who was president. So, if you don't use the access principle, you say, what was the name of the president? You look for the president in 1958. Oh, it's B. What was his name? Eisenhower. You answer Eisenhower. But if you use the access principle, then you say, the president in the base space in 2008. Who is the president? Oh, it's George Bush, right? So, therefore, it points to A. Okay? The president points to A. And then with the access principle, you can go from A to the counterpart A prime, and therefore, the question gets interpreted as, what was the name of A prime? And A prime, of course, had the name George Bush. Okay? So you can see you have these two possibilities. If you multiply the number of spaces, you can have many, many possibilities. It gets more and more complex. Again, the thing to remember is This is not for us human beings, this is not a source of cognitive effort. It's not difficult for us to do that. We have the capacity to build many spaces and to do it recursively, to build one space within another space within another space. So here is an example. This is from one of my books, the book Mappings in Language, in Thought and Language. And you'll find it also in detail in one of the readings on the website. And it's just an example to illustrate how we build and construct these spaces as we move along. Still on page 2 of the handout. Oh, I'd better hurry. Page 2 of the handout. And the first sentence is, Achilles sees a tortoise. Okay? And so we build for Achilles the first mental space that you see on your handout, and here it is, okay? So it's the base space that we start from, and we have two elements, A and B, and one is Achilles and the other is the tortoise, and there's a connection between the two, a relation, A sees B. And then also A chases B, okay? So all that is in that little rectangle that simply describes what is going on in the structure of that mental space. Okay, now the next sentence comes along. He thinks, Achilles thinks that the tortoise is slow and that he will catch it. Now, the elements in red on the screen are space builders. Each one builds a new mental space. So the first one builds a belief space for Achilles, what Achilles believes. And the next one with will, the future tense of will, helps to build a future relative to the belief space. And so the configuration looks like this. Here you build the belief space first. In that belief space, the tortoise is slow, because that's what Achilles thinks, okay? He thinks the tortoise is slow, and so that is indicated over here. The counterpart of the tortoise, B prime, is slow in the belief space of Achilles. And I don't see B prime in there. There's a little mistake, but there should be a B prime in that rectangle, because that's the tortoise, okay? So B prime got lost. Okay, then a future space comes along. He believes he will catch it. So the next space over here is relative to this one. Belief space, B, future. In that future space, A double prime catches B double prime, okay? The counterparts. Now, the next sentence says, but it is fast. So what happens is it adds structure to the higher mental space up there. You can see fast is suddenly on there because the tortoise is actually fast. So there's a difference between the base space reality and what Achilles believes, that the tortoise is slow. Again, this is a very important aspect of mental spaces, that by partitioning in these different ways, the same element, if you like, the element that has counterparts, can have different properties in each one of the mental spaces. And so we go on like this. Now we build a hypothetical. If the tortoise had been slow, Achilles would have caught it. And this is a counterfactual, okay, that we build. The tortoise, in fact, is fast, but now we build a counterfactual if the tortoise had been slow, using the space builder if and using the appropriate tense and mood. So every language differs here on how to mark the mental spaces with tense and mood. No two languages do it the same way. Some languages, I understand Chinese, for example, is very economical in terms of tense and mood. Other languages, again, have different organizations, different systems. So now you add more mental spaces. You have the counterfactual here, and you have the belief of Achilles. In the belief of Achilles, he catches the tortoise. In the counterfactual, he also catches the tortoise, because the tortoise is slow in the counterfactual and slow in the belief of Achilles. But those are two different mental spaces. Okay, now, the Achilles example was meant to illustrate how you're easily given grammatical cues, things like if and will and believe and so on, how you build a large array of mental spaces. Now, mental spaces, among other things, among many things, they solve a fundamental problem of philosophy, of language, which is the problem of opacity. Philosophers have worried a lot about what they call referential opacity. And so you will find a huge literature on referential opacity. And the idea in referential opacity is that with language, there are cases when two phrases, two noun phrases, have the same reference. They point to the same person, and yet you cannot substitute one for the other. So here is a little story to illustrate that. So it's on the handout also. So be sure you're imagining the story in your head. It's a story about James Bond. Okay. Now, James Bond is really a top spy, as you know. But people don't know that he's a spy. So there's a big reception, and people think James Bond is posing as a wealthy tea importer, okay? Somebody who sells or buys tea. And Ursula is another young woman in the story, and she sees James Bond, and she is, very seduced by James Bond. She thinks James Bond is very handsome. But she doesn't know he's a spy. She thinks he's a wealthy tea importer. So, given that, you can say it's equally true using language. It's true that Ursula thinks the top spy is handsome. We can say that because we know that the top spy is James Bond. So we can say to each other, oh, Ursula thinks the top spy is handsome. But, and that's because, as you'll see in a minute, we're using the access principle. But Ursula doesn't know he's a top spy, so she couldn't say the top spy is handsome because she doesn't know that. But we can also say Ursula thinks the wealthy tea importer is handsome, because in her, even though we don't believe that James Bond is a tea importer, in Ursula's beliefs, he's a tea importer. Okay? So, again, here is the kind of mental space configuration that we set up. We start from the speaker's knowledge and the speaker's view, and in the speaker's knowledge up there, it's on your handout, you have the character A, who has name Ursula, character B, who is Bond and a spy, and character C, who is a very ugly man, whose name is Lipton. And Lipton is really a wealthy tea importer, okay? But Ursula doesn't know that. So now we build Ursula's belief space over here, and again, there's a counterpart for Ursula, A prime, a counterpart for Bond, who has a different name, because Bond is pretending to be Earl Grey. That's his name, okay? Earl Grey. That's the brand of tea in England or the United States. And finally, you have C prime here. That's the ugly Lord Lipton. Now, in Ursula's world, B prime is the wealthy tea importer, and he's very handsome. In the speaker's world up here, in the mental space corresponding to the speaker's belief, to reality presumably, C is the ugly tea importer, and B is James Bond, the top spy. So now you can see that we can either not use the access, don't use the access principle, then we say Ursula believes, we go directly to Ursula's beliefs, we find B prime is a wealthy tea importer, and also Ursula believes that he's handsome. So in that mental space, B prime is handsome. And so that will give us the sentence, Ursula believes that the wealthy tea importer is handsome. On the other hand, if we use the access principle, then we'll go to the top space. We find B up there, and B is the top spy. So the top spy. And then the top spy, by the access principle, will access the counterpart B prime. And so we can say Ursula believes that the top spy access B prime is handsome. Okay? So that's fundamentally the explanation behind opacity phenomena. Philosophers of language and logicians have struggled to explain this by using a special intentional logic of language. But that's not really what's going on, because the access principle is a very general cognitive principle that applies way beyond the belief context. Okay, so it's a much more general principle than what the philosophers have discovered. Again, you can see that you don't have substitution. So the first one up here is true. Ursula thinks the wealthy tea importer is handsome is true. But even though we know that the wealthy tea importer is Lord Lipton, we cannot substitute. We cannot take the wealthy tea importer and replace it by Lord Lipton salva veritate, which means preserving truth. Because now this one is not true. Ursula thinks Lord Lipton is handsome is false, even though, again, this one and that one are in fact the same. So that was the opacity puzzle for philosophers, and as you see, it finds an easy solution within the mental space framework. Okay, now let me move on. Mental spaces organize our conception of time in discourse. And this was very, very nicely discovered and worked on initially by John Dinsmore, and then later elaborated into a wonderful theory by Michel Coutrer, C-U-T-R-E-R. And again, on the website, you will find in fact, you will find the entire dissertation, the entire PhD dissertation of Michel Coutrer with the full explanation of all the tense and aspect, constructions in English. So it's a very, very important piece of work. Now, I will just illustrate with a very tiny part, but it's a huge topic, obviously. I will illustrate how the organization of time sets up these different mental spaces. So I illustrate by means of a simple piece of discourse. Again, it's accessible. This is accessible on one of the readings in the website. So it's a very simple little story. Max is 23. He has lived abroad. In 1990, he lived in Rome. In 1991, he would move to Venice, and then he would then have lived a year in Rome. So notice different tenses and different moods in English, the would, the will, the have moved, and so on, are being used to organize time. And in mental space terms, this is how all this operates. You start, as before, you start from a base space, an initial space, that tells you that Max, the young man, Max, is 23. And this space is base, but it's also what's in focus, and it's also your viewpoint. So I don't have time to really explain the details of this, but the Michel Coutrer's very interesting work separates the notion of the base space that you start from, the viewpoint, you're looking at things from a certain viewpoint, the focus, what you're looking at, and the event space where some event is happening. Okay? So you start with a single space that is simultaneously base, viewpoint, focus. Then, using the English perfect form, has lived, you build an event space over here, which tells you that Max lived abroad, but it doesn't change the focus. The focus stays in your base space. And that is why English has a present form for the perfect. Even it has lived, okay? It has a past on the participle, of course, lived, but it has the present on has because the present indicates that we're not changing the focus and viewpoint. We still have the viewpoint up there, and we're sort of putting on the side Max living in abroad someplace, but we're not changing our focus. Now we change the focus. In the next sentence, on the handout here, let's see, what page is that? Page 7 on the handout, okay? So on page 7, figure 9, you will now see that you've already built the space on the left that has lived abroad, and now you're changing focus, and you say he lived in Rome in 1990. So you're switching to the 1990 space, which now becomes your focus. Your viewpoint is still from the base space. That's why there is a past form on there. Your viewpoint is from the present. You put a past, he lived, okay? But the focus is now on 1990 on the new space that you've got here. Okay, next page on the handout. Another shift. This time the viewpoint shifts to 1990, but the event and focus go to 1991. Okay, so that's where you say, in 1991, he would move to Venice. Notice the form, he would move. You could have said, just he moved to Venice. That would have been viewpoint from the base. But you say he would move. Why do you say he would move? Because it's a future with respect to this one, 1990, future 1991. So it's a future with respect to 1990. That's why you get would. But it's a past with respect to the base space. That's why you get would and not will. You get the past form of will. And finally, he would then have lived a year in Rome. You build another perfect space here without changing focus and without changing viewpoint. So when you're at the end of the discourse, your base is still up there, but your viewpoint has shifted to 1990. Your focus has shifted to 1991. And finally, the event you're talking about is an event in, is something else, the event of living in Rome for a year. Now, this is typically, again, how language operates. In order to build up time, it builds up different spaces, and then those spaces are connected. So you look at the base up there, and 1990, they're connected by past. These two are connected by future, and these two are connected by the notion of perfect. And so what the grammar does in English, again, each language has different systems for allowing you to reconstruct the right mental space configuration. So in English, what happens is that you have, if you look at the line up there, you have the base space. It's connected by past in a semantic sense, semantic past to viewpoint space, connected by future to the focus space, K. Then what the grammar does, it takes past in capital letters and it codes it in English as simple past. In English, it gets coded like that. And then the future gets coded as will. So you get simple past, will, and then the verb, move, that corresponds to the event that's happening, moving to Venice. And now, of course, you combine these grammatical forms, simple past plus will. Well, the past of will is would. So simple past plus will gives you would. And then move is the form of the verb. So you get would move to Venice. And that allows you, of course, subconsciously to reconstruct this grammatical string, allows you to reconstruct the right configuration of mental spaces. Another little comic strip, not because we study comic strips specially. We're not in the business of, studying comics. But comics are interesting because they have usually tell a very short story, and so they can be used as examples, and they have some visual aspect also that helps to understand the context. So this comic strip example is a case where the father is watching television, and he's watching a wrestling match with a very impressive wrestler, Hulk Hogan, okay? And the father boasts, and he says, "Oh, when I was a young man, when I was in my prime, I was very strong, and I could have pinned Hulk Hogan in a matter of seconds." Pin means, to win in wrestling, okay? So the father is boasting, and the son asks his mother. He says, "Is that true? Is that true that father could do that?" And the mother says, "Probably." Okay? And then, of course, there's the punchline in the joke. She says, "Of course, when your dad was in his prime, if you go in the past, Hulk Hogan was in kindergarten, so he was a little child. So that explains why, your dad could probably have beat, the Hulk Hogan who was a 5-year-old. In other words, we understand one meaning, but the mother switches. And what the mother is doing is using the possibility of a different mental space configuration in order to get a new meaning from the same words. Okay? And again, this is very typical, very important. A single sentence in the language can have many, many corresponding mental space configurations. But often in context, there will be one that is very salient, the one that everybody thinks of. And then if, like the mother, if you think of another one, then you can, transform, of course, the situation. So, quickly, and you can look later at your handouts for the details, the way all this is built is you start from a base space in which you have the television with the champion, the wrestling champion, Hulk Hogan, and you have the family, dad and mom and the son, Norman. Everybody is in that initial space. And of course, D is Hulk is a champ. D is a champ. Now, the father starts to talk, and the father says, "When I was in my prime." So he builds another mental space, T, and there's a counterpart of the father here, A1. A1 is in his prime. So that's the father when he was young, a young, vigorous father. And then he says, "I could have," and here he builds another possibility. This is a possibility space. He doesn't say it happened. He doesn't say that he actually, beat even strong wrestlers. He just says he could. Possibility. So this is a possibility space. I could do it. And then he says, "I could have pinned." And that actually builds a counterfactual space. So you can see a whole, with a single sentence almost, "I could have pinned Hulk Hogan." It builds a whole series of related mental spaces. And we end up in this one, we have the counterpart of the father, A3, and the counterpart of Hulk Hogan, D3, and, of course, the father beats the wrestler, beats Hulk Hogan. And we transfer, unconsciously, automatically, we transfer the properties of Hulk Hogan, very strong wrestler. And so we see the father here beating a very strong wrestler. And therefore, we conclude in that space that the father is a champion. Champion A3. A3, the father back then, was a champion. And we build up so that transfers to all the spaces. It goes up, it percolates up to the different spaces. And so the end result of this construction is that we understand that the father in his prime was a real champion wrestler. What the mother does is she puts counterparts of Hulk Hogan, counterparts of the wrestler, she puts in these spaces so that now you have D1, D2, and D3. Now, of course, when the father was in his prime, then D1 here, D1 was a child, right? So now we have over here in this space, D3 is a child, and A3, the counterpart of the father, pins D3. So we have a totally different space now. We have the father beating up on a poor small child, right? And of course, what happens then is, okay, this child has been transferred, and so of course, this time the interpretation is not going to be that the father is a champion. It's going to be that the father was a bully, in fact, when he was, beat up on small children. Okay? So those examples are meant to give you a flavor of how we build up all these mental spaces in discourse, in thinking, in looking at paintings and everything. I have barely scratched the surface, of course. I've only shown you a few, sort of simple examples, but they will be useful in the next few lectures in understanding the basis for conceptual integration. Let me just mention, without analysis here, let me look at just some other examples. Here's some a little bit more complicated mental space examples. This is a comic strip. Calvin, I don't know if you know this strip, Calvin and Hobbes is the tiger. And Calvin is writing to himself, but to himself in the future. He's saying, "Dear future Calvin, I wrote this several days before you will receive it." Notice he says, "I wrote this in the past," although he's writing it, because when future Calvin gets the letter, then it will be the past when the letter was written, okay? And so he's saying, "You've done things I haven't done," he says, to his future self. Of course, because there are, maybe 3 days between when he sends a letter and when he himself receives the letter, future Calvin. And in those 3 days, he's done many things. And so he says, "You're lucky. You know things I don't know. You lucky dog." And Calvin says, "I feel so sorry for myself 2 days ago." Now he goes back 2 days in the past. He says, "Poor Calvin 2 days ago who didn't know what I know." Okay. So this is, of course, a kind of joke, but you need the mental spaces to understand it. And it's very unreal. These are very unrealistic mental spaces, and yet everybody understands very easily. This is a series of further examples that you can read about in the readings. This is to show you, these are forms of metonymy, but this is to show you that the access principle goes far beyond just belief spaces or image spaces. So here are cases again. Let's just look at these four. Norman Mailer, who's a writer, Norman Mailer loves to read himself. Well, there is a connection between Norman Mailer and the books that Norman Mailer writes. And so using the access principle, you can say Norman Mailer to indicate the books. And then Norman Mailer loves to read himself, reflexive pronoun. You can get a reflexive pronoun here. It doesn't mean, the literal meaning of that would be to say Norman Mailer loves to read himself would be that Norman Mailer on his stomach has many things written, like Chinese characters and everything, and then he likes to read, himself. Now, that's not what this means. This means he likes to read books by Norman Mailer. So the access principle is working. Same thing, of course, with metonymies of this sort. Plato is on the top shelf next to Homer. It doesn't mean the two writers are sitting on your shelf. It means the books are on the shelf. In the restaurant, where you tell the waiter, you say, the waiter comes with the dishes, and you say, "Oh, I'm the quiche, and she is the ham sandwich." Again, access principle from the person who orders to the dish they order. And over here, the mushroom omelet left without paying his bill. So in the restaurant, it means not that the omelet itself suddenly, was walking, but that the person who ordered the omelet left without paying. So the access principle is allowing you to use the description omelet, the dish ordered, to access the counterpart, customer. And I'll finish with one last example. These are variants of the George Bush story. And let's see if I have one more example. These are more comic strips, but we won't do them. So here's the last example I'll use. And this is a story where John and Betty are married. Okay, so this is a married couple, the husband and the wife. And Betty asks, if I died first, if Betty died first, she asks her husband, would you get married again? So she's building a possibility space, okay? Not reality. And she says, would you get married again? And the husband says, well, I'm only 36, so, it's possible, I might. And then she says, would you live here in our home with her? He says, I suppose so. And then, what about our bed? Would you use our bed too? Sure, he replied. What about my new golf clubs? Would you let her use those too? And then John says, oh no, she's left-handed. So now, when you get the punchline, the last line, you have to reconstruct all the mental spaces to see that in John's mind, there was already a counterpart in the base space. And so he was going from the base space. He knew the woman that he would marry if Betty died, okay? And of course, in Betty's construction, there was no such woman. And he reveals his perversity with a little bit of grammar. That's why grammar is so dangerous, because notice that it's because of this little z. She's left-handed. It's because he says that we know we have to go back to the base space and we find the woman that he is preparing to marry. Okay, so I will stop for this lecture, and we can probably stop the cameras rolling, and then we can have some discussion.